Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Psychology and Spirituality, a bridge to a better life discussion. Here with me is Dr. Anahy, who is joining me to a conversation about our egos. Yes, you heard it right, about this little thing that many of us don't know enough about it. So we're going to talk about what is it and why do we even need to be talking about it, right, Anahy? But before we get to that point, I want to say that the Psychology and Spirituality program is brought to you by AMI Brazil, the United States Spiritist Federation, the TV Mansão do Caminho, and the International Spiritist Council. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you'd like to check out other channels, please check it out by clicking www.spiritist.us. And if you have any questions, any comments at all, please do send them via the chat window. We will address them if we have time today or in a future episode. Also, if you're interested to know more about this intriguing subject, we highly recommend you to the following books written by Joanna de Angelis. And they are The Conscious Being, as well as, and this is in English would be translated as Reflecting the Soul. No, we're not being cruel here because both Anahy and I can read Portuguese. This book is about to be published in English very soon. So this is just a teaser for you to know that it's coming up in English. They're marvelous, marvelous type of work. But back to us. I wanted to say, Anahy, I've been reading a lot, and I don't know why, but I've been reading a lot about both Saint Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi, and found myself just getting immersed in their commitment, right, to renounce everything so they could follow Jesus. And in that quest, they took care, their commitment was to take care to those that were the poorest of the beggars, right? And in that time, it was really that community of individuals that were suffering from leprosy. And the question came to my mind, who is the poorest of the beggar today? Who's the poorest of the poor in a way? Is it okay if we can just start talking about this, if you don't mind?
I think it's great. Hello, everyone. So I think it's great because um, if we want to do something as so important to our, inner development as following the paths of Saint Francis and Saint Clare, for instance. So the question would be, what are we going to face in this travel? Is this uh, traveling towards some place outside of ourselves, or this quest, this traveling, it's an inner quest, an inner journey, let's say. And when I was, listening to your question, Marcia, it reminded me, I had already, we are very connected, of course, because I had already thought of a sentence, of a quote of Carl Gustav Jung, the psychiatrist and Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist that created what we call analytical psychology, or we call nowadays complex psychology. And Jung says, that is a quote, okay, sentence that Jung says something like that I feed the hungry, forgive an insult, and love my enemy. These are great virtues. But what if I should discover that the poorest of the beggars, as Marcia was asking and commenting about, and the most impudent of offenders are all within me, and that I stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved. What then? I think this is a wonderful, questions. It's when Jung talks about the shadow. I'm quite sure we are going to have another very interesting podcast about the shadow, right, Marcia? It's a great subject to talk about. And we are all in need to talk about our shadows. But so when Jung in the collected works talks about the shadow, he writes these wonderful, sentences and questions. What happens if we find, and we all find when we look within ourselves, that the poorest of the beggars and the most impudent of offenders are all within us, and that we stand in need of our own kindness towards ourselves. So I don't know if you remember talking about St. Francis and St. Clara, but especially St. Francis, that his family was very rich, right?
Yes.
And his father was a very rich trader. And what happens when he comes back from one of the crusades, I think, one of, that he went to fight, and it gave him a really, it was a traumatic experience. But it was also a life-changing experience. Something within himself
Mhm.
called very strongly that he couldn't quite, he got sick, went to bed, he couldn't quite figure out. But it's, when we all say that in the psychiatry and psychologist field, that when we are really, when we think we are in the bottom, of our um, uh, inner quest, in the bottom of our inside quest, that, well, I don't have any other place to go. What do I find there? So we are all very afraid of what we find. The poorest of the beggars. When I
Mhm.
usually we are going to talk, we are starting to talk about the ego. So the ego would be the center of our it's the center of the consciousness. It guards the consciousness, what comes inside and what falls, let's say, to the unconscious. So the problem is that the ego is always, of course, worried to adaptation in the world. Okay, worried about other people, what they are going to think about us, if I'm doing right, if I'm doing wrong. To what? Right or wrong in the beginning, like children, adolescents. The right or wrong is not in this point of life, in our life circle. It's not in this point when we are children or teenagers. Really a deep questioning. Oh, am I doing right or wrong towards my own consciousness? It's not like that. It's if father and mother saying that if everything is okay, that it's good, or you are good, being a good boy, a good girl, that's it. You are very well behaved or not. Okay. So the ego is developing little by little in the beginning of our lives to adaptation, so that we can have someone that takes care of us, that loves us, that we feel secure. And then when we go to teenage years, And then we get in the beginning we get start getting an image of ourselves. Oh, I'm like this, I'm like that, because other people, first father and mother, and then the bigger family, then teachers and other adults that I feel secure and that I'm learning something from. So that's childhood, but
Yeah,
it's
and I think it's important, right? What you say, it's really important because I feel, Anahy, that there is this, maybe I can call it pop culture, the sense of it's your ego. Your ego's too big, it's too inflated. Let's kill the ego. And you're saying the opposite, right? You say that there is a linearity where that ego is very small, maybe, or even unrecognized, being nurtured through the educational and cultural background of a child, all the way to a point that I know you're going to be talking about. But I think it's important for us to say, um, let's stop thinking that you should not have an ego. There is a role for the ego, just like what we said before. There's a role for the shadow, but this is a future episode for us to talk about shadow specifically. But go ahead. I think this is fascinating, everyone.
so, yes, Marcia, thank you so much, because it's exactly that. We need a strong and mature ego, okay?
Mhm.
Because otherwise, we are going to have psychological and sometimes psychiatric problems. So, it's very important that people understand that the ego is okay, it's the center of consciousness, and it's here like our physical body, okay, helping us to adapt to this experience on earth. That is so important. We learn so much. It's such a blessing, to be able to be here and now in the physical body, learning things and improving myself and developing my soul, my spirit. So the ego is doing a very good job, let's say. um, in We are in a sense like heroes, okay, because it's so hard to be here, to be born in this world, in a sense that the ego has to struggle so much to adapt. So let's like Marcia said, um, really be grateful to having an ego and a body, okay, that then understand that the ego is intermediating the experiences of the body with the outside environment, okay, and with the inner environment also, because the ego, when I want, I have my physiology and I have my needs, I have to eat, for instance, is the ego that has to realize, oops, my stomach is empty and I need some food because my body needs energy. And so this is an inner instinct, okay? But it's very important because it's then I'm going to give my body energy to be in this experience. And the ego also pays attention, and because it's trying to adapt to the outside world, emotionally and also like physically. I have to protect my body. So if I'm going to cross the street and I see something really dangerous, a car speeding up a lot and coming in my direction, of course my ego has to register this image, and has to send a message to my brain so that adrenaline and other hormones can be thrown in the circulatory system, and I have to run, I have to step back, I have to protect my body. So the ego is always paying attention also, let's say this is in a physical sense, to the outside world, but also to the emotional information, let's say, that it's coming from the people that I deal with in my day by day life.
Mm-hmm.
especially the ones that are so important to me, like my parents, my friends, my teachers, or my masters, or my colleagues, whatever, or my bosses, whatever the person's job is, So it's very important that if I feel afraid that people won't like me, that that I'm doing something that it's not being well received by others that are important to me in some way, that my ego will say, oops, we have a problem here, you know?
So let me just go back, right? So we talked about previously that again, this is the linear, and it is maturing as we grow older, and those individuals that actually help us throughout a journey through maturity, our parents, our teachers, even our um, social network, if you will, they play a critical role in that process. But at the same time, as our ego, which is a mechanism that we have to help us navigate this life, right, to help us, to protect us, it also is the mechanism, and correct me if I'm wrong, the mechanism to regulate our physiological response to many things, including our emotional response to those people in my environment, to which we confuse many times. And let's go back. I'm going back, Anahy, to the popular culture where we go and say, oh, your ego is so large, is so inflated. I cannot deal with you because you think too much of yourself. Your mental construct of who you are is overinflated, if you will. So I think it's interesting because now you're telling all of us, including me and I, that it is required to be mature, but also that we have, in addition to learning to deal with who you are, you also use it, the ego, to respond to the external world. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah,
Or
it
yeah.
makes perfect sense. When we say the inflation of the ego, is when I
Mm-hmm.
think we say too much of myself,
Mm-hmm.
and then my ability, my capacity of empathy, for instance, of thinking about the other and considering the other's needs, then it's impaired because I am like in a narcissist position,
I
that
see.
I think of myself, only myself. But the problem is that, you see, Marcia, we are talking about early life, childhood, and adolescence. It's okay when the child is very frail in a sense, emotionally and also physically, because the child needs a person to take care,
Yeah.
otherwise it won't be able to, even to eat, to know what to eat, and to grow up in a healthy way. And but also especially emotionally, okay, because the ego is in the beginning, let's say, of being constructed, if we could say, and it's in its early development. So the child needs the narcissism in the child is perfectly healthy. Okay, the
Okay.
child thinks of herself, himself, as the center of the parent's life, and it has to be like this because of this, this frailty of the ego, let's say.
So it's a
Okay,
survival mechanism, right?
it is.
I
It is.
need this so that you out there, father, mother, or whoever is your caretaker, make sure that I am the center of attention. That's awesome.
Exactly that,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's totally natural, and the ego needs that. Of course, we shouldn't spoil our children. That's
Mhm.
not what I'm saying. Education is the way that adult and mature father and mother will do, teaching the right from wrong, and teaching the values and empathy and things like that, but always combining this. Oh, you should, do you think you should have done that? Would you like to be in your friend's shoes, for instance, when you get the toy and you don't want to give the toy to your friend, something like that? So we are teaching empathy, and we are teaching the child, the to consider the other, and also, but if you say, oh, the father or mother, you have been a bad boy or a bad girl because you are not, sharing your stuff. When you say bad boy or bad girl, that's you're going to hurt the ego.
I see.
And depending on the age of the child, actually, you shouldn't say at all, because it's going, the child, we are going to be talking about that in the next episode about the mechanism of defense. But just to give you a spoiler, the child is going to introject, we say.
I
It's
see.
going to put, like put to her inside, emotionally speaking, psychologically talking, this idea, it's going to be the child's going to be bringing to her inner world this idea that she or he is bad.
Yeah, and it's very interesting if you can pause here, because as we advance, if you think in terms of generations and generations ago, how education, pedagogy, and the child education has developed so much, right? To the point that today we talk about the helicopter parents, that they hover, and we're not doing an apology to helicopter parents, right? To spoiling your kids. But what we're saying is let's be educated into our role, our roles as parents to our kids, so that we don't trigger a defense mechanism due to judgment. You've been bad or been good.
Yes, Marcia, exactly. We are going to trigger, of course, the child is still very small, and the defense mechanisms
Hmm.
are very frail and in the
Hmm.
beginning,
Hmm.
so the traumas from childhood start in this way. Okay, we are saying
Hmm.
something really light, but we know that unfortunately to this day, with all the psychology that we have, some parents, especially if, if they haven't learned, or it's very well known that when a person has been abused, for instance, the tendency of doing the same to the children in the future will be, great. It's not 100%, of course, because everyone deals with the traumas in a different way, okay? But it's very high, the probability that a person that has been abused in different ways in childhood will do the same in the future. I think we all should pay a lot of attention to this data. It's very well known in the medical and field and the psychological field. So I think that it's very important what Marcia is asking me, because you see, so we have this frail ego
Hmm.
in the early years of childhood, and then comes the teenager years, okay, the adolescence, and the egos is still very frail, because the adolescent, the teenager, it's not anymore that child that it was yesterday. Consider
Correct.
that the unconscious, the time in the unconscious is not the same to our consciousness. Okay, we say that the unconscious is timelessness. The
Hmm.
time is totally to now, and so if I have, for instance, a childhood trauma, if I had a lot of bullying in the school or something, or have lost have important emotional losses in my childhood, everything that triggers this trauma is now. It doesn't matter the age that I have. So imagine a teenager, okay, that for the teenager, the childhood was yesterday, really, or sometimes even today, okay, emotionally and psychologically speaking. But he is in the middle of two very different and important stages in life: childhood and the adult that he's going to be tomorrow. But he's not the adult already, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult. The teenager years is, people. It's really tough for the teenagers because of all this insecurity. That's why they keep looking for groups that could can define them, because they kind of lose the ego. It's in a lot of trouble. I don't know who I am because I don't recognize anymore. Even my parents, we say in psychology that there is it's a symbolic, okay, people, but there is a symbolic death of the father and mother. Because can you imagine, you were a little child and you had to look up to see your father and mother, and now that you are a teenager, and usually they grow up really fast, so sometimes you have to look down to your father and mother, or even in the same level. And more, your development of the thinking function, okay, the rational part of the and the critical part of the person has developed a lot. The complex thinking, okay, the abstract thinking, we say, because the child has the concrete thinking. For the child, for instance, if the child wants to play and it's raining, and if suddenly it stops raining, then the child will think that, oh, it stopped raining because I want it. Okay, this is the concrete, in a very simple explanation, concrete way of thinking. But the teenager has abstract thinking. He considers things. He's thinking, reflecting about who I am. If he can recognize when the mother or father say something, but do something different from what they are saying. And the small child cannot do that, but the teenager can do that. So they are going to question authority. That's very typical of the
As it
teenager,
should, right? As it should. It's
as it
perfect.
should.
Yeah, it's perfectly normal. And I say this, Anahy, because many of us, parents, we question, why did I have two little angels, three little angels of children, and all of a sudden they become monsters? And it's no, 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 no. This is actually, if they didn't, you should be question yourself, why aren't they trying to become independent, right?
Exactly. And don't forget, Marcia and everybody else, that they are in this explosion of hormones already.
Correct, correct.
So
Yeah.
imagine the ego having to deal with all this inner pressure of the hormones and of the abstract thinking of seeing, oh, but I thought my father and mother was 100% right in everything, and now I see things that they are not, so okay, because now I'm looking of what the paradoxes and the way they think. Sometimes they tell me to do things, but they are doing the opposite, and they don't see that. So it's very threatening. That's why sometimes they get really angry and I kind of very difficult to deal with, let's say. Like, so I wanted to bring back again Saint Francis, because he was in the end of the teenager years when he went to war. And we could say that in the Middle Ages, there wasn't really a teenager, or we couldn't say teenager years in
Hmm.
the Middle Ages, because the people had to grow up suddenly from childhood to being adults. But if you are from a rich family, okay, like St. Francis, probably you would have a little bit of what we call, sorry, of what we call the teenager years. But what happened? He was sent to war. Can you imagine the trauma? Sorry. So what happens is that he's sent to war, as I was saying, and um, it happened to him a lot of what happened to our teenagers. Who am I? I don't recognize myself anymore. And here in our teenager years, it's pretty less traumatic, let's say, much less traumatic than for St. Francis, because our teenagers, hopefully, not unfortunately all around the world, but our teenagers in the West, especially, they don't need to go to war.
Mhm.
Thank God. Well, let's hope it goes on like this. So what happens that we have St. Francis in this crisis in the ego, but I'm sure we're going to be talking about this in other episodes. He listened, actually. He was in conflict, a very deep conflict, but he listened to an inner voice. I don't want to give people spoilers, but we all have an inner voice.
I
We
love it.
that
Mhm.
it's a higher consciousness than the ego. We're not going to be talking too much about that today because today we're concentrating on the ego.
Uh-huh.
But I wanted to tell you that it's so good that Marcia brought St. Francis, because he was a very young person when he had to go through all this conflict.
And we forget that, right? When we read whatever is the source of your reference to him. And I was being from Brazil, St. Francis is such an important figure. And we hear this and we hear that, but I never actually thought about him as a young adult, not even adult yet, having to go through all that goes through, internally, and go to war, and the war becomes that source of conflict that coincides, right, with his inner voyage to his consciousness. Does this make sense?
Makes total sense. So you see, there was something, and it's very. Why do we we have in our cultures movies, the
Hmm.
Marvel heroes, or
Yeah.
you know, yes, other heroes, because it's a way of representing what the egos, our egos, go through. It's
Hmm.
like, but we don't have to look outside for heroes. We can understand that we, each one of us, in a sense, are heroes,
I
not
love it. Yeah.
celebrities.
I love it. I love it. Look, we don't have to have a TV at home anymore, or go to the theater. It's all here, right? This duality of good and evil, or what's right and what's wrong. Love it.
Yes, and but of course, the teenagers want some outside reference because they are
Mhm.
so afraid and
Yeah.
so in doubt of who they are, who they really are. So society should think of that, and I think education all over the world is lacking in understanding and in giving the teenagers not everything that they want, because this is not education, and everything that I think it's right, because this would be like spoiling, like the child
Correct.
or the
Hmm.
teenager. But reflecting with them, they also, like St. Francis, have an inner voice, because
Yeah.
we come from we could say from the same light source, okay, that some people call God, or the transcendent being, consciousness, the higher source of creation, whatever way, or whoever, whatever name people want to call it. But we are our really brothers and sisters, even psychologically speaking, and come from this source of creation. So it is very important that we understand that is within us, as Jung says, the shadow, the things that we deny, repress, and that because the ego is afraid of not being accepted, of not being able to adapt in this world.
Mm-hmm.
It's very afraid of actually what's come from inside also, because it's afraid that something that's coming from my unconscious will threaten the way that I think of myself, and of course then it will spoil the way that other people will see me. But as Jung is saying in this sentence, I have to face my inner enemy, at least to understand that it's not an enemy, that it's some aspects of myself that I have to learn how to deal with. It's not, I don't, it's not only of the outside world that I have to learn how to deal, to be patient, to tolerate some things, to be diplomatic to others, to have empathy, all the, the moral values. But I need to also be compassionate and to have understanding with myself. Otherwise, I'm going to be creating, and we are going to see this in the second episode. I will create my own inner enemies. And so I will, because everything that I deny in myself, and we are going to see other ways that the ego defends itself from the inner, let's say, contents, from the unconscious contents, will simply get bigger, or they will, spoil my relationships, and this goes on and on. So the thing is that I people usually are so worried with the outside world that they forget to pay attention to the inner world. And there is where we really can make a change. And if we can make a change in our inner worlds, then we can make a change. We can help better other people and the outside world. But we cannot do that if we keep like say running from ourselves. And like the teenagers, they do that a lot because they are afraid of all this insecurity. So they look for groups that they can connect to, and that they can say, oh, I'm like this because those are my friends and their characteristics are the same as mine, because I identified with them. This is part of the journey of this stage in life. But you see, what happened to St. Francis is when he gets in all this crisis, his ego matures. And in a sense that we could say that the others around him, not only the people, of course, the beggars, the people with leprosy, right, that Marcia was talking about, but all the nature, the animals, the plants, the planet, he started feeling, in a deep connection with everyone.
And he
So
was
this
he was he was considered, sorry to interrupt, but he was actually considered a lunatic, if you will, at the point. And if I imagine, this is based on what I'm reading, but I imagine if he were not the child of a very wealthy father, right? He may not have had the leeway to grow and to have a following based on what he learned about himself. This is just conjecture, but I think it's very important because today, I think, Anahy, today, this community of spirits in living in this earth, this we're talking about in the 21st century, I see with such optimism how we are caring for the world. We're caring, we're aware, we're consciously aware, if I may say, use those words, of nature and our impact to nature and vice versa. So it's no longer me, everything's about me, but now we are part of the whole, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think it's very interesting, Marcia, that you said, yes, if we were, each one of us has a personal history, you know. We come to
Hmm.
this world, according to Jung and to Joanna, with, we could say, with a mission, with things that we decided, you know, that we would experience and try to learn of ourselves to develop our spirits. We are travelers of eternity, as Joanna says. So, for instance, St. Francis, as Marcia was telling in the beginning of our podcast, of our conversation, that he renounced, like St. Clare also, they renounced of, you know, the material life as they, you know, they knew it, of having food every day, having clothes, having a shelter, uh, you know, the roof over their heads. They renounced to a lot of things, but especially, I think St. Clair was also from a rich family. I'm not
Yeah.
sure
Yes.
if,
Yeah.
yeah, so much as St. Francis, but they, you know, they were rich, and this renunciation, let's say, was very important, because, as Marcia was saying, if otherwise, maybe he would just be considered a lunatic or something.
Hmm.
Okay, a beggar that was out of his mind or some. But he was. People listened to him because he renounced, and he was telling things, not only, you know, saying like a confusing words or a confused words, or without knowing what he was saying. He was remembering what Jesus said about, you know, being open and loving the others, loving nature, loving others, helping each other. So it was not a renunciation to be, you know, crazy or saying things that have no reasoning. No, he was renunciating. He knew what he was doing, because he
Hmm.
said he wanted to be like Jesus, to follow his path, and to really be open to nature, to the others, to be connected in this brotherhood of men and women. So I think that's very important to remember. And also that when he kind of lost himself to the world, it's when he found himself and he found his mission. Then the hero is born, psychologically speaking, because then he's not doing things like Marcia said. It was not an inflation of the ego. Oh, I'm better than anyone else. No, I am like anyone else. I am brother of everyone. It's the humility of it all, you know, that
And
says,
authentically so, right? It just, if you here can ever have an opportunity to read, please do, because to me, the more I read, Anahy, the more I find nuggets of incredible teachings on what is to be authentic and what is to uncover. And I'm putting my hands here because I think of what Joanna de Angelis brings to us, the X's, the vertical axis, which is our connection, right, to our spirit and connection to our creator, our light source, or and also the horizontal axis, which is that material, where the ego puts us to be able to live in a material existence. But I think it's so interesting, when we look at him and the threat, what would otherwise be a threat to whatever he was doing, and he looks at the person, the so-called attacker, and he welcomes them. And that's when I see when you talk about this renunciation of what it is to be the egoic Saint Francis, to be the true Saint Francis, that person that embraced himself totally, right, as an individuated being without the personality. Then we start to see that he sees the truth in everyone, including when you're attacked, including when people don't like you. And this is especially interesting when we talk about what we've been talking about, those adolescent years, those very young years when we don't know who likes us or we don't, and we start to play around with who am I need to go to this group of people to see if I can find myself there, and I go to another group of people, and so on and so forth, until I kind of find who I am. But
Exactly.
I am really fascinated, Anahy, because we are out of time. So I know we're going to continue this conversation, but why don't you maybe wrap up with what are the key points for us to leave today with some awareness of what is the ego and why is it so important for us to talk about it?
Yeah, so I think it's great because so I wanted to remember everyone that the ego is the center of our consciousness
Right?
and is the subject of all our adaptation attempts. It selects all psychic material that enters consciousness. It is the ego that provides the personality with identity and continuity. Okay? So St. Francis could only find himself because first he lost himself
Yes.
but with the ego, my own truth, like Marcia was saying, my inner truth, not the way that people look at me and think of me, but the way that I really am inside. And remember, everyone, it is through the ego that we develop the sense of existing.
Oh,
So
wow.
it is
Hmm.
very important. The ego has all these functions. And I want just to finish with one of Joanna de Angelis' sentences. The conquest of consciousness is a very painful birth of the unconscious, which continues to hold a significant part of the psychic contents that the ego needs. So, in the unconscious, there are a lot of psychic contents that the ego needs and must assimilate. That's why we have to go to our inner journey, okay? We
Hmm.
have to find ourselves to, to put some light in the darkness, because for the ego, the unconscious, of course, is very dark because it's unconscious. So we have to put some light there, okay, so that we find the psychic contents that we need, the ego needs, and must assimilate, says Joanna. In that moment, when it becomes aware of the potential's repository and begins to express itself through it, consciousness manifests itself. So even as a small child and adolescent years, we are doing that. This that Joanna is saying unconsciously. But what happened to Saint Francis? That it was the example that Marcia brought. It was an assimilation, as Joanna is saying, and a need of the contents that were in his unconscious. Okay, everything that love for Jesus, that love for Jesus' path, the inner strength to follow this path, that it's not easy for any one of us up to this day, okay? The path of renunciation, of
Yes.
love, for really love, not inflation, for ourselves and for others. Okay, really feeling the brotherhood of men and women all around the world, and all the moral values that bring us unite and close, and not that separate us. So all this path uh, we have to find within ourselves, and there are a lot of psychic contents that we have to work, as Saint Francis had to work. Okay, face his fears, face his struggle, that really, believe me, makes the ego more mature and more and stronger. Okay, and stronger, so that we have a stronger ego to do what? To follow this path of
Awesome.
renunciation and of self-discovery.
Love it. I love it. We are at time, and
Very
I will meet again, Anahy, to continue this discussion, focusing on the defense mechanism that our egos bring. But I wanted to say thank you for being with us today to share this amazing conversation, and I look forward to see you again next week. Bye bye.
pleasure. Bye bye, everyone.